for the Susan Taylor Podcast, where we discuss the yoga of mind, medicine, and healing. Author of Feeling Good Matters, Sexual Radiance, and the Vital Energy Program, Dr. Taylor imparts authentic knowledge and practical tools that inspire, educate, and empower us to be a healing force for positive change. So join us and take your life and our planet to the next level.
Hello and welcome to episode 42, Growing Healthy Food, a look at regenerative farming. We're talking about foods and nutrients for health and healing over the past several podcasts, but we never really take a look at where food comes from. Currently, there's a lot going on in sustainable energy, food, and farming practices, and it appears now that sustainable just isn't enough. So I thought today to talk about some techniques that we could learn and use to regenerate our soil and crops because we've stripped the fields of their nutrients. In today's podcast, I'd like to talk about regenerative farming and what the new trend is in this type of farming, the research to back up the claims, and some practical tips so that you could start your own garden with these principles. Growing up on a farm, I remember we used to rotate our crops, provide fertilizer. That seemed to be enough at that time. But as decades passed, we started to need to augment the soil more and more. We started practicing no-till, the use of compost in place of fertilizer, and we provided cover crops at the end of our growing season, which I'll talk about in a minute, helping rebuild the soil. These were the practices, and today we call it regenerative farming. And this type of farming, we're talking about regenerating the soil, and this type of farming takes a clear approach in agriculture, and it's not just so much about sustaining the land in its current state, but it's about bringing it back to its original vibrant state, creating greater biodiversity and more nutrients, stronger soils, and actually, the bottom line, healthier food. You know, no one will argue that we have demineralized and devitalized our soil with pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, not to mention overplowing of the soil. And that new move is happening when we regenerate, regenerative agriculture, they're calling it, describes farming and grazing practices that, among other benefits, helps even reverse climate change by rebuilding the soil's organic matter and restoring degraded soil biodiversity. And that results in what we call the carbon drawdown. That's bringing carbon back into the soil and improving the water cycle. Because as we know, with global warming, we have carbon going into the atmosphere, heating everything up. So this would actually bring the carbon in the carbon cycle, would bring the carbon back down into the soil, which will help benefit and decrease global warming. It's quite interesting, the research that I've done on that recently. Specifically, we can look at regenerative farming as a holistic approach to growing practices that leverages the power of photosynthesis in plants to close the carbon cycle and build soil health, crop resilience, and nutrient density. You know, many times we're eating vegetables now and we think we're doing healthy things, which is better than not, of course, but the nutrients are just not available. The decline in nutrients in each product is amazing if you look at the numbers. Regenerative agriculture improves soil health primarily through the practices that increase the soil's organic matter. This, it doesn't only aid in increasing soil's biota, that's that we talk about the microbiota in our gut. Well, soil has its own biodiversity, biota, as we would say, that increases the soil's organic matter. And this not only aids in increasing, as I said, the soil biota and diversity and health, but it increases the biodiversity. And when there's more biodiversity, we get a healthier plant and we get more nutrients. And it also helps with increasing water holding capacity of the soil surface, and again, as I mentioned, the drawdown of carbon into the soil itself. Very, very interesting. Research continues to reveal the damaging effects to soil from tilling. So this is something that can actually be used in order to support and regenerate the soil. And as I mentioned, Why is it important? Well, because the health of our soil and environment serves as the foundation for our food that we eat. Unhealthy soil is an unhealthy life, and that's proven. So, what are some of the practices that those people that are doing the regenerative agricultural practices or farming practices? Well, the practices, they are practices that contribute to generating and building soils and soil fertility, as I just mentioned, and the health of the soil overall, increased water percolation, water retention, and having better water runoff instead of it being caked and packed. It also helps increase biodiversity and the ecosystem health and resiliency of the environment, and it helps to invert the carbon emissions. And what we're seeing is our current agriculture is helping with that when they practice these to start decreasing global warming by changing the carbon cycle. Let's take a specific look at the practices. We know what they do and the benefits, but let's take a look at some of them and then how you could do some of these in your own garden. The no-till minimal tillage idea is because tillage breaks up, it pulverizes the soil, and it also destroys the fungal communities while adding excess oxygen to the soil for increased respiration and CO2 emissions. So all the CO2 which we need in the soil goes into the atmosphere. And it can be one of the most degrading agricultural practices, greatly increasing soil erosion and carbon loss due to breaking apart this microbiome of the soil. You know, we always talk about the microbiome of our gut being so important for mental health as well as overall immune health, etc. Well, the soil has that same component. Remember, nature and our own physical organism are synergistic. So whatever happens in nature is happening to us and vice versa. If we're unhealthy, nature's unhealthy. If nature's unhealthy, we are certainly unhealthy. So the no-till farming, as it's called, helps to stop the erosion and runoff of topsoil, a process that has been shown to occur faster, but it can be rebuilt. In some places, it could even take up, though, 850 years, I was reading, just for 1 inch of topsoil to form. Isn't that amazing? 850 years. You may say, well, how does this relate to me? Well, stripped and eroded land produces less nutritious foods since the loss of minerals is exponential. Zinc, selenium, is just to give you an example. It also produces less overall yield, and the land eventually becomes barren and desolate, reducing the world's total amount of arable land. So although that's scary, studies do show that no-till farming, we're not turning it up, those methods can actually decrease soil erosion by more than 90%. And it's obvious right now that we don't have time to lose any more soil, and we need to start taking care of our soil and focus on revitalizing our old farming methods to supply the microbiome. A secondary effect of not tilling is soil capping and what they call slacking. And what happens is soil gets plugged and it actually causes more runoff, and it becomes so hard and caked that there's a real problem with growing. And the no-tillage idea, in conjunction with other regenerative practices, does enhance soil aggregation, water infiltration, and retention, and carbon conservation. However, some soils do benefit from, interim ripping and breaking apart these hard pans, as they call it, and it helps with the zones. But it's under a controlled setting. It's not something that we just do all the time. Another practice with regenerative farming is the use of cover crops and native grazing animals. And that might sound a little bit much, but cover crops are amazing. I've been using them for 3 years in the garden beds, and I learned it from someone who practices regenerative farming, and it's quite great. I don't have the animals to graze because these are raised beds, but What happens is when they do practice cover cropping the area with native grazing, that once the field is harvested, you get these nutrient-dense cover crops, and they're planted and left till the following summer. Then the cattle can graze on these cover crops, fertilizing the land as they go, right, because of their fecal matter, and the roots of the destroyed plants decompose and further enrich the soil, so they're also breaking up the roots of the cover crop. And this is assuming, though, that the cattle are not filled with hormones or other toxic chemicals that would be released into the soil. You know, people say manure is great for the soil, but manure is great as long as the animal is healthy. So keep that in mind. But for this group, I don't know if we have really any large-scale farmers here. We might just be doing some raised beds. But it's something to consider if you are using manure. I know sometimes I get goat manure for our garden beds. And you just have to make sure that they're not wormed at a certain time, because those medications and those chemicals will go into your food. Soil fertility is increased in this regenerative process through the application of, as I mentioned, the cover crops, also crop rotation, compost, and the animal manure. So I mentioned 2 already, which restores the plant soil microbiome, and it actually helps with the essential nutrients. We do have the use, and it's been over the years, the artificial and synthetic fertilizers. What they are doing, people think they're doing good by using them, but they actually create imbalances in the structure and the function of the microbial community in the soils, bypassing the natural biological acquisition of nutrients from the plants, or for the plants, excuse me. And that creates a dependent agroecosystem with weaker and less resilient plants. So what's happening is the more we're feeding artificial, the plants are losing their resilience. Their immunity is going down, so they're not as strong. And then the plants die after so many generations. And studies have actually proven that, because research has observed that application of synthetic and artificial fertilizers are contributing not only to, it's contributing to the climate change, because, you know, the energy cost of production and transport, that's obvious. The transportation of fertilizers, even the chemical breakdown and migration into water resources and the atmosphere of these fertilizers, and also the distortion of the soil microbiome. And so that's something we really have to think about. And it also, these artificial practices accelerate the decomposition of the soil organic matter. So basically, they're killing it. It's almost like when we look in medicine, where they say, you know, get off your crutches and start walking, let the bone heal. We're no longer sitting in wheelchairs anymore. Now we're told to go out and start moving when we want to heal a bone or heal something. It's the same principle. We don't want to weaken the plant. Same kind of principle with giving artificial crutches. We want the plant to thrive and on its own microbiome. So moving in building biological ecosystem in this diversity that we want, it begins with inoculation of the soil with composts or compost extracts to restore the soil microbiome, its structure and function. So people know about compost now. In fact, you can buy, and I'll give you some ideas, you can buy little pails for your in your kitchen, and you can start putting organic compounds in there, and that helps to really add to your garden, and it really helps. And so this will help with the whole ecosystem. It's critical that we have to change synthetic nutrient dependent monocultures that are low biodiversity with soil degrading practices and start bringing into something new that's going to sustain and regenerate itself. So we're looking at regenerative practices. Research is now finding a link between soil-rich, good microbes and human health. The greater exposure to microbe-rich soil has been correlated with greater diversity in the gut and the protective health effects that come with good bacteria. Well-managed grazing practices, as I mentioned, stimulate improved plant growth, increase soil carbon deposits, and overall pasture and grazing land productivity. And it also greatly increases soil fertility, insect and plant biodiversity, as well as the soil carbon retention. These practices not only improve ecological health, but they also the health of the animal and the human who's consuming. We've already mentioned all of that. So the feedlot with confining animals to feeding systems have really created some damaging effect on the whole environment, including the animal itself. To sum up, regenerative farming does encompass numerous practices that benefit the soil in which crops are being farmed. And it's about being minimally invasive, that's what we're talking about here, and supporting a natural symbiotic relationship so that bacteria in the soil, with grazing, you're putting bacteria back into the soil, grazing cattle, and everything in between are working together as they're meant to. This accumulation of organic matter feeds the beneficial microbes and fungi and it helps to retain more water in the soil. So the soil actually becomes drought tolerant. It holds the water and it results in a darker, healthier, more productive soil. And again, providing the animals that are not fed artificial chemicals in their food or are not injected with hormones to produce milk and meat is something has to also be considered. And you might be wondering why I spent time on this, because I realize, I talk about vegetables, functional foods, functional nutrition, superfoods, but where does it all start? It starts in the soil, because without healthy soil, we can't have healthy bodies. And without healthy soil, we are in big trouble. The bacteria and fungi present in fertile soil help digest nutrients and protect plants from the pathogens and other dangers, and this plays a role very similar to the way the bacteria works in our own healthy gut and immune system. My takeaway from all this fascinating information about regenerative farming is that it's not only the seeds and plants and the harvesting that matters, it's the very soil that matters. So feeling good matters, it's all dependent on our soil matters. And how can we support this movement? Start a compost on your countertop, build a small garden bed, and plant a few cover crops. Each one of us can do a little bit. And if you're not inclined to do the green thumb route, go to your local farmers markets, at least support them, and talk to your nearby growers and support their efforts. Continue to take care of our land because we need this land and we have to allow it to regenerate. When you support them, you support your health by buying foods that are locally grown, nutrient dense. So make sure that they're not spraying and they're educated if they're not already. Many are. So that we can continue to thrive as well as our children. We want our children to have healthy food and for generations to come. That brings us to the end of this episode. And if you'd like to be notified weekly for new podcasts, please subscribe. The Susan Taylor podcast is available on iTunes and Google Play, as well as Stitcher and TuneIn. And also, for those of you that are not on any of those, you can go to susantaylor.org, where you can click on the podcast to subscribe. I'd like to say again, thank you for listening. Any questions or comments, they're coming in. I enjoy them, and we'll create podcasts based on what the audience wants to hear. And until next time, remain calm, consciously aware, living in the moment.